Good afternoon. I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. I'm joined today with my colleagues in this room, Jasmine Tabibi and Diane Lalonde. On behalf of our whole team, even those that aren't in the room with us, I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. It is on understanding how immigration policies shape gender-based violence among immigrants who have temporary or precarious status. Wherever you are on Turtle Island today, please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. We commit to making and bringing justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country. We are bringing today's webinar from the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub. And before I introduce our speakers, Dr. Rupaleem, Bhuyan, and Dr. Margarita Pintin-Perez, I will just go through our webinar format for today. So first of all, we will hear from our esteemed presenters for about an hour. And during that time, we would ask you to type any questions or comments you may have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And during the last 15 minutes, that is from 2 p.m. to 2:15 p.m., we will present as many of your questions as we can to the presenters for their response. The presentation slides are posted on our website, and Sarah also emailed them out to everyone earlier this morning. At the end of the webinar, in the chat box, you will see a link to the evaluation, and we value your responses. And the fact that you got the slides earlier this morning is because people said in their evaluations that they wanted to have the slides in advance and to be able to follow along with presenters. So that's how important the evaluations are. But there's another reason they're important. When you complete the evaluation form, you will be directed to a web page where you will be prompted to enter your full name and email address, and a certificate of participation will be generated and emailed to you. And we always like to remind you that there's no connection between you providing your name and the actual responses that you give on the evaluation. So they are anonymous. The webinar recording will be posted on our website within the next few days. And once posted, an email will be sent out to all those who have registered so they can access this recording. Dr. Rupaleem, Bhuyan, and Dr. Margarita Pintin-Perez are both accomplished scholars and have relevant experience in the field, and actually a much rarer combination than you would hope for in this and other important fields. And Dr. Rupaleem's current research examines how immigration policy contributes to gendered inequality and different forms of gender-based violence, with a focus on collective action with and by migrants who seek dignity and human rights. And I'm sorry, I forgot to say Bhuyan in her surname. Dr. Margarita Pintin-Perez's research has focused on systemic and everyday forms of violence, examining how dominant discourses and representations of violence serve to frame and secure social inequality and subjection. Margarita is currently Senior Coordinator for the Initiative to End Gender-Based Violence at the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, or as we know it, OCASI. There's much more about their experience on their bios on our website, but for now, that's all we're going to say because we want to hear from them and they have so much to share with us. And so with that, I'm going to welcome our speakers and turn it over to Dr. Bhuyan and Dr. Pintin-Perez.
All right, thank you, Linda, and folks at Learning Network for hosting us and organizing this incredible platform. We were having fun watching and seeing how many participants are joining, and I'm trying to imagine all the places that you all are across Ontario.
I think it's
it says 267. It's snowing here in Toronto, and hopefully you all are somewhere safe and warm. So I will advance some slides, and as Linda was saying earlier, we welcome to hear your feedback and questions, your thoughts, how it applies to the work you're doing towards the end of the webinar. So just as a quick overview, we're going to be doing some background around the context of Canadian immigration policies and how they contribute to precarious status. We'll be talking about how those are linked with different forms of gender-based violence against immigrants. We have a few different case examples that will be highlighting some of my own research with migrant caregivers and some of the work that Margarita is doing, building leadership with folks across Canada. We'll also be inviting you to work through with us some of the myths and counter narratives that shape how service providers, but even people in different communities understand gender-based violence against immigrants and refugees and non-status people, and how that then shapes the responses to different forms of violence. And then the case study that Margarita will share through work at OCASI will be looking at community-based responses that hopefully can inspire and connect with some of the work you're already doing. So I will first give you a sense of us. We're laughing at this moment. We had a chance to present some of our shared work in Mexico City, where it's looks like there it was a little bit warmer than it is here today. I can just tell you for myself, something, you know, in terms of a personal narrative, and something Margarita we've been both working through is we are immigrants here in Canada, and learning about our responsibility, especially in relationship to Indigenous communities. The place where we're sitting right now, the University of Toronto, is on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, Mississaugas of the Credit River. And this is a relationship that we are trying to figure out our role in, especially amidst the incredible solidarity work happening across Canada in support of the Wet'suwet'en. As immigrant settlers, we understand it is a long history of colonization, and trying to see how we can honor that, but also find spaces for solidarity in our own work. Having my own immigrant background has been a lens that shaped pretty much all my life. I grew up in the United States of parents who came from Assam, India. And though I was always called the American in my family, the immigrant experience led me into doing work, especially around immigration policy and gender-based violence. So look forward to sharing some more of that in just a moment. So I'll turn it over to Margarita.
And in a similar way as well, we were talking a little bit about our relationship to the work and our interest in this. And we were talking about how, in my case, I am the daughter of 2 refugees from El Salvador. And definitely growing up, starting to complicate that relationship a little bit as well, and thinking about that common narrative in Canada about immigrants who are worthy of protection, the good immigrant as well, and what that starts to look like, especially now when places like Central America are not necessarily spaces where Canada sees a role in protecting migrants from there. So that has been kind of part of our conversation with some of our shared work as well.
Okay. So if we look at this slide, I wanted to invite you to take a moment, and maybe you have some paper in front of you, to reflect what this image means for you and how the ideas that we associate, maybe the values, maybe the emotions with this space, how that might shape the work you're doing in the field of gender-based violence or other support services that you may be offering. And we'll try to link back to your own personal values and understandings and how they may shape our understanding about some of the policies that affect immigrants and refugees. I'm assuming many folks on the webinar are themselves immigrants and refugees and or work with people in a regular basis. The policy context that I wanted to share to some extent goes back to the beginning of Canada. I won't be able to speak at length about this, but as someone who came to Canada more recently, I came about 11 years ago, I find it interesting to hear the specific dates that are understood as significant in Canada's history. preparing this talk, I was looking at the date of Canada's Confederation in 1867, which is understood as the Queen and British government approving Canada to emerge as a new nation, which was very different from the history I learned in the United States, where there was a war. And early on in Canada's conception as an independent nation, it started thinking through who belongs and in what ways. So you see the first Immigration Act in 1869, and this law didn't say much about selecting immigrants. It was mostly focused on safe passage from Europe, since passage overseas was the primary way people were coming as immigrants to Canada. It also was, in 1876, the law that is still in place as the primary legislation governing Indigenous peoples, setting in a very dramatic way the role of the new state in, I guess, taking charge of territories and Indigenous peoples, and in many ways disrespecting the treaties that had previously been approved and agreed upon. We also see early on in Canada's history ways of imagining who is excluded from Canada. So in 1885, there was the first Chinese Immigration Act, which was excluding or putting conditions on migrant workers who were coming to work in Canada, mostly in railroad and logging, and subsequent dates, which were exclusions for Chinese, for people traveling overseas from South Asia. And this continued on through World War I and World War II as well. So Canada's early history is one of shaping itself as independent, but also as a very much a white settler state. If we look at the contemporary context, we have the removal of racial exclusions, which happened in the 1960s. This was a period of civil rights struggles across North America, as well as around the world, many countries struggling for independence from colonial rule. There was also major shifts in migration in the global economy. So in 1967, Canada introducing a point system, which replaced the racial selection process and instead placed this emphasis on who's going to be able to contribute the best for the Canadian economy. And this point system is based on education or skill level, age and health, and to some extent remains in place, although now we call it express entry. We also have an emerging multicultural framework in Canada, starting in 71 and then further institutionalized in 88. What this envisioned was Canada as a space that was welcoming and tolerant of people of various backgrounds, to ensure rights of equal participation, and to promote diversity as a strength of the country. And I think this rhetoric is something that is really inviting to immigrants, but as we will look at some of the changes in immigration policy, not all people living here are envisioned in this idea of equality. So early in this period, in 1973, this is the introduction of the first temporary foreign worker program. There have always been migrant workers in Canada, as I mentioned, with the railroads and logging back 100 years. In this case, it was the beginning of Canada's participation in migrant labor forces of people who are granted a temporary permit to live and work in Canada, but often don't have access to permanent residence. Our current legislation, which is written under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, it was last updated in 2001, although there are amendments and changes to this legislation on a regular basis. I feel like the disclaimer I should add for your questions is that neither Margarita or I are legally trained. So we pay a lot of attention to these laws and policies, but we won't be able to give legal advice, but we certainly can give our analysis and maybe our opinion on how these laws are shaping the experience of gender-based violence. I feel like it's important to also talk about how this idea of Canada is continually being contested. And as I mentioned earlier, the solidarity protests going on across Canada for the Wet'suwet'en, and this idea of who gets to decide how the territory is used and what values, protecting the land and the earth for future generations over the short-term economic interests are driving our current policies. So just to give you some more context, this is just a glimpse of who is living in Canada and where are they coming from. This is the 2016 census data. We have 7.5 million people living in Canada who the census has tracked as foreign born, so they're born outside of Canada, they're not Canadian citizens, they come here as immigrants. This represents 1 in 5 people. Now, the distribution of where they come from is pretty much all over the place, although the largest numbers are coming from China and India, different regions of Africa, as well as different regions of Europe and also the United States. Something to think about also is, where are immigrants going to? So in the last decade or so, there have been some shifts from the original historic destinations of the major cities, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, to some of the interior provinces and Atlantic provinces. Some of this is driven by provincial nominee programs. This allows provinces to nominate people who are already living as temporary foreign workers to apply for permanent residence. We still see, however, the vast majority of immigrants living in British Columbia, Quebec, and Ontario. Some of the cities in Ontario will even have upwards of 50 to 58% people who are born outside of Canada. So when thinking about the region you're in, you may be in an area that has a majority of immigrants, and the diversity of those immigrants is one of your challenges, given their various backgrounds and languages and experiences. Or you may be in an area that has relatively few, and finding resources that can be suitable to folks may be your challenge. So this is something we can talk about, hopefully, in the Q&A. A quick glimpse in terms of how people come into Canada in relationship to their immigration status. So I think in the general trend of immigration, we often have considered what are some of the cultural differences that immigrants have, what are some of the challenges they have arriving in a new country, being separated from family and community. And in this case, in this webinar, I really want us to think about what were their legal paths into Canada, and how does that shape their trajectory, both in the short term as well in the long term. So this slide is looking at what are the different streams for permanent residents, people entering Canada or applying for permanent residence within Canada. And if you think about the people who you work with, how might they have been shaped by some of these programs? People coming through the current point system, express entry, for example. There are also economic immigrants who are entrepreneurs or investors. There's the provincial nominee program I mentioned. There's the migrant caregiver program, and also people who are dependents of these workers. We also have family sponsorship, which I know is very visible because of the cases of sponsorship breakdown, whether it is a partner or a spouse, or in some cases, a relationship between a child and a parent, or parent and grandparent. And then we have the humanitarian options, which include resettled refugees, as well as refugee claimants or asylum seekers, and people who are applying to remain in Canada on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. Humanitarian applicants are often the most visible because we have a lot of public discourse about refugees, but the majority of immigrants are actually coming through the economic class. So this just gives you a quick glimpse of the numbers. I was able to capture the numbers most recently from 2017. One of the challenges of doing this is finding good data. The current Immigration Refugee Citizenship Canada, IRCC, they are sharing some raw data, but you often have to dig through the weeds to get these numbers. So in 2017, if you look at the distribution, you see the emphasis on economic migrants. So Canada is really prioritizing those people who are seen as contributing to the Canadian economy, most likely in the skilled labor class. There is still commitment to family unification, and then also to refugee flows, which vary usually between 30 to 45,000. So the total is around 250,000, and this has been steady for many years. In contrast, in 2018, the number of temporary residents is almost 3 times the number. Here you see a really high growth in international students. I think the number this year was upwards of 650 or 70,000. We also have quite a few temporary workers and also refugee claimants who are waiting for a decision on their claim or waiting for a hearing to get that decision. So if you think about the communities that you're working in, the people who are coming to access your services, to what extent are you seeing people in these temporary categories? If you look at the trend over time, in the next slide, we have the orange line, which is showing the kind of steady influx of people with permanent residence. So Canada stands out around the world as being a country that's actively recruiting immigrants, in part because we have a stable or negative population growth because of the birth rate, for example. However, the number of immigrants coming with a temporary residence status is now 3 times the number of people with permanent status. So again, something to think about when you think about the populations you're currently serving. So one of the things we want to make sure we do is really think through what is precarious about having an immigration status that's temporary, and how does this contribute to different forms of gender-based violence. So there are several academic scholars and grassroots groups that have been thinking about precarious status in general as those who are excluded from the rights of citizenship. And when we think about citizenship, it's not only this idea of belonging and having that legal status, it's also your identity and the rights that you can claim from the state. Some of those rights might be related to having the absence of things that citizens, in theory anyway, have granted. So you may lack work authorization if you have a precarious status, or you may have a disruption in your legal right to work. You may not have the right to remain permanently in Canada, even though that may be your intention. You may lack social and political rights that we associate with being a Canadian, for example, the right to go to school, to call law enforcement without fearing of being deported, or even accessing a domestic violence shelter. There's also not being dependent on a third party for your right to remain in Canada. So many people who are coming on a temporary foreign work visa are tied to their employer, or if you're a sponsored family member, you're tied to that sponsor, even after you achieve permanent residence through the economic undertaking agreements. And then finally, those who are fearful or have the risk of being deported from Canada. Now, in 2010, there was a change to Canada's criminal justice laws. So even permanent residents who commit a crime and are sentenced for more than 6 months, they may be subject to removal from Canada. So permanent residence is also precarious in ways that it wasn't in the past. So if you're thinking about our framework, how do we link this broader political context to gender-based violence? So we're going to walk through some of the ways we're thinking about gender-based violence through an intersectional lens, how we're really looking at structural forms of violence, so intersectionality, not just around people's different identities as myself, as a woman, as someone who has an education and teaching here, someone who has an immigrant background, but also the structures and systems that shape my life and the opportunities, the lives of the people you work with. And then using an anti-oppressive lens when we're thinking about how do we work with immigrants and refugees who have a precarious status. So we're not going to spend a ton of time. I'm hoping you've had opportunities in different spaces to think about intersectionality. This is a quick visual just to remind us of all the different kinds of ways we have different life experiences and how these shape ourselves, what's important to us, how we respond and work with others as service providers, as people working in organizations, as community members. It also shapes the kinds of opportunities people have or options when they're seeking support and safety. One of the conditions that you may want to think about also in an intersectional lens are what are the different kinds of precarious status that might make people vulnerable to different forms of gender-based violence. This is some of the different categories that we've seen in some of our research over the years. You may encounter people who are non-status because their visa to enter Canada has expired, or maybe they have a work permit and it expired and they're eligible to reapply, but there's a period in which they are non-status. You often encounter people who have a sponsorship breakdown. This is a common occurrence. I think there's a lot of general knowledge about this in the domestic violence field especially. There are definitely people waiting for a refugee or humanitarian claim determination, and that period will leave them uncertain about if that claim will be recognized, and then what are their rights while they're in that liminal state. There is also the fear of having to return to their country if their claim is refused. And for those who have a refugee claim denied or dismissed, they also will have often a deportation warrant placed on them. That deportation warrant means they're more visible to immigration authorities and therefore have to make that decision to remove themselves, meaning leave Canada, or to face removal by Canada, or to go under the radar and find ways to live without being recognized. There are also a lot of people living in families or households where people have different immigration status. And I think we still have a lot to learn about how does that shape the rights of the people living in those families. You may have siblings who have a different status, maybe one who was born in Canada with citizenship and another who arrived with a temporary or precarious status. You may have different statuses between parents and their children. Some of the work that I've done in different communities, you really see that the citizens are also feeling disenfranchised, even if they have citizenship, if their parents or other siblings are lacking secure status. And then the category of trafficked person, which is quite complex, may be people who may have their documents, they may have a legal right to remain in Canada, but they may not have control over their documents, or the people who are in control of their movement and their documents are also jeopardizing their legal right to be in Canada. These are just some of the examples to think about. And when we're thinking about how immigration status is connected, we really want you to theorize with us forms of violence that are really determined by structural processes. And here we're leaning on some of the work of a medical anthropologist and physician, Paul Farmer. He's really helped us think through structural violence as one way of describing the social arrangements that put individuals and populations in harm's way. These arrangements are structural because they're embedded in our everyday lives, in the political and economic organization of our social world. They're often very much taken for granted. They're also violent because they cause injury to people in how we've set up our social institutions. So neither culture nor pure individual will is at fault. This makes it really hard for us to hold people accountable if the violence is produced by our structures. So when you have historically given and economically driven processes, they force and conspire to constrain individual agency. So when we're thinking about working with people, or even thinking about how our own work is shaped by the structures we're in, the nonprofit industry, the kinds of funding contracts that we're working under, contracts that often focus on programs and not operating funds, contracts that often limit our ability to do advocacy, how does this constrain our agency as well as the agency of the people we're working with? So when we think about some of the forms of structural violence in relationship to gender-based violence, and in this webinar, we're not spending a lot of time defining gender-based violence. I'm gonna make this assumption that you've had some exposure to the range of abuse that might be in part due to gendered inequality, intersecting with different forms of racism. In this case, we're looking at policies and how different systems contribute to gender-based violence. I think it was about a year or 2 years ago, I had a chance to participate with OCASI's Us Too call to action. And this is just an image of the report that came from that roundtable, thinking through what are these intersecting forms of gender-based violence that affect the lives of immigrants and refugees, anything from family reunification policies to the systemic racism and xenophobia that often contributes to economic inequality. There's really high rates of poverty amongst immigrants and refugees, especially women who are parents or living in households where they have trouble finding meaningful wages, or they have options only to get precarious work. So how do we think about these systems as also forms of violence that then constrain the agency of women who are dealing with gender-based violence in their personal lives, or who are contending with the threats of violence in their everyday life outside of the home as well? So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague to walk you through some myths and narratives.
Great. So for the next few slides, what I'm going to focus on is kind of an exercise. So what Rupaleem is sharing around structural forms of violence and the examples we have, really embedded in all of this is we're also kind of trying to detect and talk about the ways that we're talking about violence. So the way we define violence, the way we think about it. And in that is a lot about power, right? So who decides? How do we make those definitions? And the power that these ways that we think about violence, because it's not just descriptive. And I will give an example, and I start with this first slide. So I'm talking about addressing gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women. So the way we speak about violence, the terms that we use, we can sometimes take that for granted. So why are we emphasizing, just to give you an example, this idea of addressing GBV against non-status refugee and immigrant women? When we say violence against communities, what we're trying to emphasize, or what's significant about that, is that we're talking about the kind of violence that's directed at communities, right? So it's a way of us talking about, for example, colonial forms of violence, structural forms of violence. It's a way of gesturing toward these kind of historical foundations of violence, which is quite different than, for example, when we think about addressing gender-based violence among or within communities, which then kind of starts to emphasize the type of violence that might be unique to a community, but doesn't necessarily suggest that that cancels out the types of violence that are also happening at a more systemic and structural level. So with that being said, why we emphasize this, I think it's really important to think of some of these narratives around the way that we understand and respond to gender-based violence. And so when we talk about this, and then we're kind of tracing some of that language, what we try to emphasize, and we do this in some of our work as well, is we're thinking about the use of language, the discourses that are there, things that are taken for granted, and understanding really its functionalism, right? So what is it used for? And what can it sometimes kind of hide or deny when we frame it in a certain way? So for the first slide here, we're going to start with a myth. So the myth here is violence against racialized immigrant women is a cultural problem. So I pose this out to everyone, all the participants who are listening, to think a little bit about that myth. What are the implications when we frame violence through a cultural frame? And what does that mean for our work? How does that kind of organize the type of work that we do as service providers, social workers, etc.? So the myth here is violence is something that is cultural. The counter narrative there, and why we bring this up, is that when we emphasize the role of culture, what can be done in that narrative is that violence that is occurring against racialized and immigrant communities is viewed as something that is isolated to that cultural community. And that means that that becomes a kind of dominant framework for understanding. It becomes a dominant framework, and it does start to create a color line. It creates a type of color line between the causes of violence. And it also, if we think about it, it also ends up being a way that we are responding to violence, because I can use this as an example. When I was earlier starting out in the kind of violence against women work and organizations, I typically was the Latina social worker who would be able to provide culturally sensitive services. And of course, we can't deny that there's a lot of progress in that and that it's necessary, but it's typically embedded within general understandings of the way that violence is experienced and responded to. So emphasizing the cultural piece is important, in particular when we're thinking about accessing services and some of those barriers that are there. But at the same time, when you emphasize culture, you de-emphasize kind of that systemic side, which is also racism. So what are we trying to say with that idea? Part of this counter narrative is that when you frame it as cultural, you also can be denying some of those more systemic sides. And so not understanding, for example, how the anti-violence against women movement and some of the organizing and the work that happens can sometimes then deny some of the racist forms of violence that immigrant, non-status and refugee women experience. In terms of the next myth, we talk about criminal justice and social service responses to gender-based violence provide safety to immigrants, refugees, and non-status women. So if we ask the audience a little bit about that, what would be the implications, right? Are these safe spaces or safe responses in terms of addressing gender-based violence against immigrants and refugees? So maybe give you a few seconds to kind of think about that. And a big part of this kind of thinking around the criminal justice system and the social service responses that are asking us to challenge that kind of taken for granted knowledge is what it's trying to emphasize is that the criminal justice system and the social service responses that we've created can kind of be worked around this idea of an ideal victim. So it's a victim that can call the police, and that be a safe opportunity or safe option for them. It can sometimes be a victim as well that leaving the violence and going to a shelter are viable options. But we also know that if that's looking at violence through a gender lens, there's also other different systems that are at play. For example, race, for example, class. So we can think about the criminal justice system. As much as there's been so much progress and so much that we need to also recognize in those spaces, it's not always a safe option. And the criminal justice system and the criminal frameworks as well, we know that there's over-policing in some communities, right? We know that that calling the police is not necessarily also a viable option. So that's kind of where that counter narrative comes in, where we're challenging some of these systems that are in place and that sometimes are emphasized a little bit more around the individual perpetrators of violence and not necessarily thinking about those structural kind of foundational ideas in which the law and the criminal justice system are very much embedded.
Okay. So we've given you a lot of information. We've been talking about the policy context and linking Canada's history as a white settler nation to the current priorities in recruiting immigrants who can contribute economically to a space that has a value for multiculturalism and diversity, but also has many forms of precarious status that really produce vulnerability amongst immigrants, especially those who are racialized women, and how those vulnerabilities intersect with different types of gender-based violence. So how do we bring this a little bit more into kind of examples? And I'm sure we'll connect even more with some of the work you're doing. So I'll give you a little bit of a case study example from some research we've done. I've had an opportunity to work with migrant caregivers through the Caregiver's Journey study. Here we were looking specifically at policies introduced between 2014 and 2018 with the Migrant Mothers Project. And then I'll turn it back to Margarita, who will speak about a current project at OCASI, which is building leadership capacity to address gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada. So I had to start with these incredible images. I had a chance to work with migrant caregivers living in Canada for several years as we were working on a Caregiver's Journey study. And they, from the outset, reminded me of the long history of organizing amongst migrant caregivers who are calling for landed status now on arrival, landed status referring to granted permanent resident status upon entering Canada, and how that is something that would be in respect for the work and contributions they're giving as often domestic workers caring for our children, our elderly, or people with disabilities. So the Migrant Caregiver Program has been in some shape or form in Canada since the beginning of Canada's inception. In this image on your left, we're seeing a protest rally taking place by folks organizing through Intercede. It was a settlement organization founded by migrant caregivers, most of whom at the time were from the Caribbean countries, who were Black women or women from the Philippines. So these are racialized women in the global economy who often don't have the means to enter Canada as an economic immigrant who's granted permanent residence, but they were able to find entry as migrant caregivers. In 1981, they're asking for status on arrival. And in 2017, I had an opportunity to join this demonstration outside the offices of Immigration Canada, and they're still asking for many of the same rights. So in our study with migrant caregivers, some of the things we wanted to highlight are the structural conditions that place the caregivers in situations where they're dealing with exploitation and abuse, but they're also working towards a goal of permanent residence, which makes them often required to continue enduring those conditions. This kind of goes back to the constraints on their agency. They may not want to be in those situations, but with that goal of permanent residence, they remain. So in our study, we were able to interview 35 migrant caregivers, most of whom were from the Philippines. We were doing this research in Calgary as well as in Toronto, and working with migrant caregivers who we were able to hire as our research assistants. And then they recruited through their networks and sat down and had one-on-one conversations with other migrant caregivers, or we organized small group conversations to hear about some of the shared concerns, but also some of the strategies people use to support themselves and get through this difficult period. In this document, we have an infographic, which we'll share as a resource that links the structural conditions. We wanted to talk about some of the discrepancy between what is legally written down on their contract versus what caregivers tell us really happened. So on the left, you see the minimum wage and limits on working hours are part of the legal contract for their work. As we know, many of us are seeing constraints on these types of work conditions, not only migrant caregivers, but in this case, their contract does talk about overtime pay, break time, paid vacation, and having an 8-hour work day. However, all of the caregivers we met with experienced a range of 14 to 16 hours a day as their typical work experience. In most cases, folks were working 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. They often had no opportunity to take leave if they were feeling sick, or they were concerned about taking leave because anytime they weren't working, it was work that they wouldn't get paid for, or it wouldn't help them meet their work conditions. So many migrant caregivers, the terms of their work are, under the program, they work 24 months under an employer who they often have a closed work permit with, meaning it's a designated employer on their work permit. After completing 24 months of work, they can apply for permanent residence. Now, the program has changed since this time period, but some of these conditions help explain the structural constraints on their agency. In the next slide, you'll get an idea of some of the forms of abuse and exploitation that people shared with us in our interviews. It was quite common for people to hear their employers put them down, to yell at them and insult them. So for me, as someone who has worked for many years in the area of domestic violence, this sounded very similar to forms of psychological abuse that we see in a domestic violence situation. Especially hard if it's an employer who you're dependent on, not only for your wage, often who is housing you, but also because their employment is necessary for you to get access to permanent residence. We also had many people share stories of being forced to care for other people. So they may be working for an employer who had 2 children, but maybe they had a family gathering where other children would be present and they would be expected to care for those other children. Sometimes this was happening on a regular basis. Sometimes they were asked to do work outside of that caregiving role, paint the house, clean the car, some cases being asked to clean the workplace that the employer had in a different location. We also saw across the board people who were unpaid for long and extra hours of work. Some of the forms of structural violence we also heard were being denied privacy. There was one woman we spoke with who talked about having a private room in the house, but oftentimes on her days off, when she was struggling to learn English so she could qualify for permanent residence, the children would continue to knock on her door, continue to ask her for things, and she felt compelled to stay involved in the family life. So this was depriving her of a chance to meet some of her personal goals. We also saw lack of nutrition as a common concern. Sometimes families employing a caregiver would not want the caregiver to eat the family food, or there may be differences in food. Maybe the family kept a kosher diet and the caregiver wasn't able to cook their own food in the home. And that left the caregiver with different options. Where are they going to cook their food? Sometimes what migrant caregivers would do would just have a simple hot plate in their room where they would boil noodles. And it just really struck me as a kind of food insecurity that is often invisible because they are employed and living usually in a comfortable environment. Some of the other forms of violence had to do with controlling their movements. So some were not allowed to leave the house or call their family members. This especially impacted people living in suburban regions or living in rural areas, especially in Alberta or outside of Toronto. In some cases, people were not given a key to the house, so they couldn't come and go as they pleased, and sometimes would have to wait for family members to return in order to enter the house, which can be very uncomfortable, especially in Canada's long winters. We did hear of a few examples of sexual harassment, people being touched, people who were especially being flirted with by one of the employers, sometimes allusions to having a romantic relationship that they had to figure out, how do I maintain this relationship, or they'd have to quit. And we did have at least one person who shared with us that they were assaulted by their employer. This gives you the range of kinds of abuse and exploitation. And one of the things we learned in our community consultations as we were meeting with caregivers, people who had completed the work requirement, they had transitioned to permanent residence, they had reunited with their children, they often still carried a lot of the pain of the abuse they experienced during their time working in the program. So though you may not be working directly with temporary foreign workers, my guess is you have been working with people who came to Canada on a temporary or precarious status and may have some trauma that they carry with them that they haven't had a chance to explore, or that may still be shaping their lives. Many of the caregivers who we met in our research, in our community forums, we found did not often turn to gender-based violence programs to report the abuse. They often did not call the police. In some cases, there were underground networks of people who were supporting each other. I know at least a few cases in Toronto where someone needed to be removed immediately from an abusive situation. Rather than call the police, however, they would turn to friends or informal networks to help them relocate and find a safe home. These kind of underground safety home networks is very similar to the origins of the domestic violence movement in the 70s, but it was troubling to see that still occurring today and kind of the unmet needs of many caregivers. We also learned that many caregivers are experiencing prolonged family separation. And this was often their key concern and their priority. And what that meant in the lives of individuals was they often would not take care of their own personal health needs because they were striving to complete that work requirement so they could reunify with their children. The isolation, the risk of depression is there given all these conditions, and also the fear of losing immigration status. I won't be able to go more into the details, but the changes in the caregiver program have made it harder for many caregivers to transition to permanent residence. And this has created a period of crisis in many communities. Despite many of these challenges, we also found incredible signs of mutual aid and support, people finding support through their faith communities, people staying connected through social media, either Facebook or WhatsApp. This really helped people stay in touch with their family and friends in Canada, as well as family members in their home countries. And we also saw people getting together and just sharing good times, like folks in Calgary going for a hike, or here in Toronto meeting for a meal. And these were really important. One of the things as I started, that there is incredible collective organizing happening led by migrant caregivers, organizing for rights with other temporary foreign workers. I think this has been inspiring. The analysis they share about a type of Canada that should be better is something that I think can inform a lot of our work. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Margarita.
Great. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about a project that's being led by the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants at OCASI. And I should say that this project is very collaborative, participatory in method. And so a quick little shout out to everyone that's listening that's part of our team, because I know we shared this link wide and far. So this project here is funded by Women and Gender Equality, which is formerly Status of Women. And what we were talking about, or what I was mentioning earlier, a little bit about those like counter narratives and ways to challenge the way that we currently respond to gender-based violence, has been very much a driving force for this project and part of this kind of foundation and story of the project. So it's very much inspired by critical kind of grassroots and community-based movements that have been trying to think of collective ways to respond to gender-based violence and ways of reinvesting in community responses. And a big part of that is to consider, like I mentioned earlier with the counter-narrative, is what does it look like when we're addressing gender-based violence that's not necessarily relying on the criminal justice system, that is taking into account the kinds of racism and classism that are also part of the experience and that shape a very different relationship of violence among non-status refugee and immigrant women when they experience gender-based violence. What this project is doing, and it's, you know, it's in our title, building leadership capacity, but it does so in a structural and kind of community way. So it's not just thinking about leadership in that individual, where individuals are leaders, but thinking about what it would do. What does it look like when you are thinking about individual leadership, but also collective kind of advocacy? So what would that look like if we think about it more as community-based leadership responses to gender-based violence? So I'm going to kind of walk you through the way this project is organized, and what it's modeled after. So this project develops two promising practices that have been developed by partners on the project. And one of them is the peer champions model. And that's modeled after the immigrant and refugee communities, neighbors, friends, and families campaign. And what this does is this campaign has more to do with developing kind of education tools, building capacity among community members at an individual level, but also thinking about the community. And it stems from this idea of training the kind of the bystander, and a bystander also being then equipped to kind of navigate and perhaps provide resources or direct people who've experienced gender-based violence to the adequate resources. But in the case of our program, we take on some of these ideas of like popular education and developing tools and activities to generate conversations around gender-based violence, but we do so very much closely with survivors of gender-based violence. So that is a way of kind of redistributing resources. It's a way of creating opportunities so that survivors of gender-based violence can also identify what are the priorities? What does it look like? What would these groups look like for them and to meet their needs as well? So that's a very important piece to kind of shift some of this narrative around who are decision makers, who are the people involved in the thinking and the programming around gender-based violence. It's also related in building off of this model by the Rights of Non-Status Women's Network, which is a strategy and a network that's grassroots in its model and community-based. And it's creating a network of people, so a community of people that come together to collectively think about some of these issues that, in this case, non-status women were experiencing, to raise further awareness, to build kind of campaign work and advocacy strategies. And what's really important about it is that it creates kind of a base of frontline workers, community advocates, community members that can kind of come together and to start to think about this and create and broaden some of their understanding on how to respond to gender-based violence. And keeping in mind that some of this kind of advocacy work used to be a part of our mandates and used to be a part of the work that we were doing in settlement, for example, but also in the violence against women sector. So it's in a way trying to address what now has been underfunded or that we see much less in this kind of community and creating kind of more of a broad collective response, that kind of shared responsibility that's required. So what our project does is it merges and brings together these two promising practices. And so what we see happen with the peer champions model and with the community advocacy network is that the peer champions model is not only now focused on the empowerment piece, but what does that look like when you bring it together with the community advocacy network? So you're not just only focusing on empowering, but you're also thinking on the context of social justice. You're thinking about the knowledge exchange that can happen in those spaces, and you're thinking of ways that you're collectively identifying priorities. At the end here, and this is this schematic here that you see the print might be a little bit small, but it's the idea is that you're really building a community-based leadership kind of capacity, programming and response that'll shape and inform practices and services to address gender-based violence at a regional and at a national level. Currently, our project has wrapped up a needs assessment and environmental scan that we conducted across Canada. And some key learnings, and what's been interesting about the project is that we're very much creating room to question some of the ways that we've traditionally responded to gender-based violence or some of the programs that have been available to us. And in doing so, we've been questioning and challenging some key concepts. So even though we're thinking about building leadership, what does leadership actually look like? How do people identify with this idea of leadership? So we were asking these types of questions to community stakeholders, to non-status refugee and immigrant women that we had the privilege to speak to and interview, or they attended different community events. And in terms of some key learnings is we really challenged this idea, or we learned that people were challenging this idea about leadership, that yes, it can sometimes be in this conventional kind of framework, kind of someone who's a boss or someone who has a public persona, but there's so many different ways that people also assume a leadership role that kind of challenges that. And so leadership can also be about building relationships, about being someone who's empathetic and modeling those types of traits and characteristics. So that was something that we were unpacking. As well, we were looking at the ways that safety and healing has been framed, and we've been talking about it more at a structural level. So what does that mean? We mean that safety for some women is not necessarily leaving the spaces of violence, because it might not necessarily be something that can be done right away or in immediate, but looking at other spaces within the community that can be framed as safe. So this kind of structural safety as well. What happens if also the frontline workers, the people they're working with, have also a certain type of knowledge that then allows these spaces to be safe if they're accessing services. Another piece was when we were looking at healing, we were listening to women share with us that sometimes healing comes with a piece where you have to recount the pain and some of that experience. But healing can look different for people, and it might not be an emphasis on the experience of violence, but healing at a structural level, we were mentioning, would be, for example, sometimes I just want to play sports. Sometimes I just want to be in a space where I can gather with friends. Sometimes I just want to dance. So these types of different responses that can seem perhaps even trivial, but it's an alternative. It's a different type of way of working this idea of healing. In terms of advocacy as well, we're talking with different frontline workers, community members, talking about what does that shared responsibility look like? What does advocacy work look like, especially when people are so overburdened with high caseloads? And so that really important kind of community organizing work that occurs and that is part of challenging and addressing gender-based violence.
Okay, so we're here at the home stretch and we just want to end with a few kind of key points that we've gathered from different parts of our work. And these are not things that we are necessarily inventing. So how do we translate our awareness of all these different forms of structural violence and some of the pain and grief that comes along with experiencing and witness violence into our actions, and how we can translate them in ways that will heal and help us recover, but also build community, as Margarita was talking about. So centering relationships, I think, is at the heart of this. Relationships that we have with ourselves, with our coworkers, with the communities with whom we're working. Some of the work coming out of British Columbia, I'm thinking of Olena Hankipski, Renee Comier, who argue that centering stories is consistent with any intersectional approach that prioritizes the lived experience. It's also necessary for the pursuit of social justice. Some of the stories that we center should also find ways of recognizing grassroots leaders. I'm realizing I need to move something here. And the people who are directly impacted by injustice. So how do we involve people seeking justice in our work as decision makers and as people who can inform and assess the quality of the work that we're doing? I think we optimally will be holding government accountable. I know that it's tricky sometimes in navigating contracts with different levels of government, but negotiating those contracts in ways that you can consistently do that advocacy work, whether it's at the municipal, provincial, or federal level. And also getting those governments to implement the gender-based analysis that many of them have on their books to determine how they're distributing their resources. So this is just a few of the principles in mind. And I feel like in closing, I wanted to return back to some of the women we've spoken with. And many years ago, actually Margarita working with me on a project with women looking for refuge in Canada who had experienced gender-based violence, we encountered someone who we're calling Lasso, who was undocumented at the time, had filed a refugee claim based on domestic violence, which was denied and dismissed, as was their appeal. We just learned that they received a humanitarian and compassionate application approval, which is just phenomenal. However, it was after living in Canada for 11 years without an authorized status. So at the time that we met Lasso, these were the words that she shared with us. I think I'm gonna get emotional. Okay, I'm gonna try not to get too emotional. I've always believed in human rights. Ever since I was a little girl, I've seen injustices committed. Living in Canada, I see that it's not perfect. A lot needs to be changed with Indigenous people, with non-status people, with the poverty. Honestly, Canada gives a lot of foreign aid and seems like a very noble country, but indoors, it has a lot of deficiencies. I'm a great human rights believer, and I know we all have a right to a worthy, decent life, to a worthy, decent job, to be protected. I think it is a time to recognize human rights, that we are people, that we are worth it, that we have dignity, that we can provide to society, that we are not criminals. For all the people who are suffering, who are being hunted, they're being hunted in a figurative way, no? That is against our dignity. So these are the call to action from Lasso, who at the time was a refugee claimant, deny protection, that we can struggle and aspire to a Canada that does protect everyone's human rights. We will end there. I will just direct you, we're not going to talk about them at length, but we have quite a few resources on the slide. Here are our contacts if you need to follow up with us. We also have included resource links. There's so many resources across Canada, so we just pulled a few, and also things that maybe are less conventional in the gender-based violence world, some of the work led by migrant workers and activist work happening across Canada. We also have a glossary of some of the terms we used in case you want to return back and see how are we using these terms that we were throwing around throughout the presentation. And if you're interested, we also have all of our references for sources for all the extra time you have to do a lot of extra reading. So at that point, we will stop and welcome some questions from you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. We're just sitting here in our team, so grateful for your presentation. And we'll thank you at the end, but we want to really give you a chance to respond to some of the questions that are coming in. So we're going to start with, what would be your advice for shelters in supporting folks with precarious status when a person's residence with or use of a shelter could challenge their immigration status as outlined in work or student visas?
I don't have the legal advice. So I feel like this is something I want to be cautious about. I'm not as familiar with the legal consequences. I think anytime we need to find shelter for people, we need to decide some of the short-term goals. So making sure people are immediately out of harm's way, as well as some of their long-term goals. I think shelters, having developed really strong relationships with folks who can provide that legal advice, will be helpful, and especially developing some organizational policy so they know when and how to reach out to people. I think that there's a lot of discretion on the part of immigration officials. So I know even as a university-based professor, I have international students who are trying to figure out, especially in a social work program, some of the terms when they're unpaid part of their work. They're often placed in practicum to get field experience, to what extent that might be seen as a violation of their student visa. And it's unclear, frankly, because sometimes you call an immigration officer who says that is a violation, and other times they say it's not. So I really think developing strong relationships with folks who can give that legal, hopefully pro bono advice, and really taking a human rights approach. So how do we ensure that someone's right to access the shelter won't jeopardize their long-term goals as well? Yeah. It's a little bit more vague because I don't feel comfortable giving legal advice, and maybe Margarita can ask as well.
I mean, I know that in our research, when we were going across Canada, speaking to frontline workers, this is something and a topic that came up. And consistently what we heard was there wasn't necessarily always knowledge of what the worker can do in that capacity, right? So what exactly they're allowed to do, and that also speaks to when the laws and the policies are changing so frequently, workers have a hard time and trouble being up to date with what that looks like, right? So what they're allowed to do, if they're supposed to allow, if CBSA is at the door, what some of those actions. And we heard where we did see some success around that was when different spaces and cities, people were organizing. And so just that kind of work of where people are meeting collectively and talking about, this is what's been happening at our shelter, for example, and there are those networks. You can see that that kind of knowledge exchange is so necessary in order for there to also be kind of a front, for example, of people that are working collectively to respond to this and find the right, what is it that we're supposed to be doing in the shelter? How do we ensure that we're protecting the women who are coming here and not this being a pathway for their detainment or deportation?
Yeah, and I will give one example, although this is not me recommending people to break any laws. But there was during the period when I was supporting and working with the Shelter Sanctuary Status campaign in Toronto with shelters to provide access without fear to women who were non-status. We did see a growing number of shelters who at that time were helping women staying in their shelter apply for a personal needs allowance from the City of Toronto. This is a little bit of funding they get while they're staying in the shelter. There were on the form a place for people to write down the SIN number, but we saw a practice where shelters were not putting a SIN number and in place either putting a name or even a pseudonym, and indirectly working with the city folks who, because there is an access without fear policy in Toronto, we're fulfilling those claims so people could get the money without having to provide that identity information. I don't think this was happening in all shelters, and it wasn't happening outside the City of Toronto, but that's just one example of some of the systems advocacy work that Margarita was referring to.
So that really is helpful.
So the next question is, what options does a young mother have when there is a sponsorship breakdown due to domestic violence?
Right, so part of this again is the legal question. And I think it is, I can base it on some of the work that I know of and always needing to consult because everyone's circumstance is going to be very different. So figuring out and working with someone to find out what is their current legal status can be very tricky. So you can be working with someone who may perceive themselves to have a certain legal status or may not know what their legal status is, especially if they were brought under a relationship where there are power dynamics and that immigration is used as one of those controlling mechanisms. So I know in my work, I've often encountered people who thought they had no legal status, though they were permanent residents, because this was the information they were shared. This doesn't mean that they are going to be completely safe, but that's something to pay attention to. There are about 3 kind of general scenarios that come to mind. First, if someone is in the process of applying for permanent residence, they have not received yet an approval on their application, that sponsor can withdraw their support on that application. So that does leave that individual, the sponsored spouse, without yet permanent residence, in a vulnerable situation, and would need to work with a lawyer to see if they have another means to apply to remain in Canada. It could be a humanitarian and compassion application, or there may be another route, depending on the qualifications of that person. If there's, in that period of time, they've received permanent residence, but they are in that 3-month period where the sponsor is required to maintain them financially, it does not affect the permanent resident, the sponsored spouse, to leave that relationship. They retain their permanent residence. It is up to the sponsor then to have to remain accountable with the government of Canada. There are cases where people who have permanent residence and they leave that relationship, where part of the abusive techniques are to charge that person with misrepresentation. This could be a situation where a family member or that abusive spouse calls, leaves a phone message or even an email, because unfortunately Canada has been criminalizing marriage fraud and made it very easy for people to leave anonymous tips. If there is a charge of misrepresentation, in immigration terms, misrepresentation means that your intention to immigrate as part of a marriage is called into question. So that person would be required to demonstrate that they entered into that marriage with good intent, as well as work with hopefully some support to demonstrate the abuse that occurred in their relationship. I'm not giving legal advice, but those are 3 scenarios that could impact someone who is a sponsored spouse.
Thank you.
Margarita, did you want to add anything to that?
No,
No, I'm good, thanks.
Okay. And I'm not sure whether you will know the answer to this, but I'm going to pose it.
Okay.
What sort of training, just as an example, trauma-informed, gender-based violence understanding, do the government workers have who are reviewing TRP and H&C applications, and how, as service providers, can we advocate for improvements to the slow and lengthy immigration process?
I don't have.
Yeah, I did do a training once a few years ago with people working in immigrant refugee citizenship services. It was quite fascinating. I don't know exactly. I think my guess is it's very limited. So maybe a day, maybe half a day, or an hour of domestic violence training. A promising practice I saw when I lived and worked in the US was there were dedicated immigration officers. So this may be something happening in different regions. I know when the conditional permanent residence policy was in place, it didn't happen immediately because those of you familiar with that conditional permanent residence, it required newly sponsored spouses to remain in a relationship for 2 years in order to keep their permanent residence. And there was an option to apply to get out of that condition if you were experiencing abuse from that partner. They removed this conditional piece, so I don't want to create confusion, but it did give an opportunity to see, it was a terrible opportunity, but to see how is the government going to process these claims of abuse for people who are trying to get out of that condition. Over time, what I saw were in each province or each region, a specific officer was designated. And at least in the Ontario region, where you have a higher number of immigrant applications in general and really strong resources for advocacy, you saw kind of a learning curve where people had better outcomes working with that immigration officer. This doesn't really explain to us what's happening right now. And my guess is there are people probably in the webinar community right now who have really great knowledge, and hopefully they can share that in different ways as well.
Thank you.
So there's been a couple of questions now from people who are wondering if you could suggest any resources, maybe like especially online trainings around gender-based violence against non-status immigrant and refugee communities.
Sure. Actually, I can plug OCASI in right now. We are going to be hosting a series of online courses that are focused on gender-based violence, understanding and responding to gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women. And this series will be taking place. It starts in March and it'll go through for the next couple of months. And so this is also, developing off of some of the partners that are on the project currently for our building leadership capacity. So for example, Deepa Matu's toolkit, there's some really important kind of work that has been generated around people that have been thinking about refugee and immigrants with precarious status, and it's specifically tailored for people that are in the settlement as service providers in the settlement sector, immigrant and refugee serving sector, and also violence against women sector. So I can share that and follow up if you'd like. I can share kind of that information for our online courses, and it can go out to everyone who's listening.
Yeah, and we did include several links, so I can just verbalize them since I know we're not sharing the screen. But like in Vancouver, the Battered Women's Support Services does incredible work, as well as Ending Violence Association of BC. There's also a Mothers Without Status program led by the YWCA there. So you can see some of their websites, which are on our link. Here in Toronto, there's an incredible resource called the Community Legal Education Ontario. So it is going to be specific with that interaction between federal and provincial law, but those of you around Canada may still benefit from the federal law. And they give really accessible legal information in lots of different languages. So you may also be able to find resources to share. And it could be everything from how to apply for a humanitarian compassionate application to some of those questions around sponsored spouses. There's also, as I mentioned, several incredible grassroots migrant organizing groups. Here in Toronto, there's a network, Butterfly, which is a migrant sex workers network. They put on a really fabulous webinar themselves on how to work with and support sex workers who have different kinds of immigration challenges as well. There's also Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. They work with folks across Canada and have been really amazing at synthesizing a policy analysis and writing it to influence policy, but also to educate people in the community. So keeping track of some of their work, I think, would be really helpful.
And we'll share some of the resources that you've identified. We'll, on the webpage where the recording of this webinar is, we'll make that list.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Okay, and great to know about the upcoming online courses, Margarita. I think that will be, and that's open to anybody who registers?
That's right, yes. I'll send the link as long as someone just registers with the username, it's with your email, then you can participate and they are free, available online.
So then that's available to those that live in Ontario, but also anywhere in the country?
That's right, exactly. Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Unfortunately, I'm so now engaged in this. I was just poking my colleagues that it's their turn to ask a question, and they reminded me that we're at 2:15, which we do honor the time commitments because people make the time and they tell us how much they appreciate that. So we have to end here. Thank you both so very much for bringing information, research findings, but also for translating it into some of the ways in which organizations and agencies can better support and also how they can advocate. And to also share with us some amazing resources in addition to this webinar. So thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to invite you to share with us again in the future.
Hope so. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a great time. Thank you so much. We look forward to staying connected. Good luck to everyone.
Wonderful. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.